Next, we're going to be looking at ecosystems and biomes. And to do that, we have to acknowledge, what is a habitat? Well, it's an ecosystem that is composed of a community of living organisms along with the abiotic features of their environment that support them. So within an ecosystem where an organism lives is called its habitat. It's the specific environment of an organism. And again, we're looking at both biotic and abiotic parts, or living and non-living. An ecosystem might be something like a pond, whereas a frog's habitat is the edge of the pond in the shallow water. So an ecosystem could be an entire ocean, but a blue whale that lives in the ocean, its habitat is anywhere in a temperate to cold part of the ocean waters. So ecosystems are a little bit broader than a habitat. So the role that each species plays within its ecosystem is just as important as its habitat. Its role in its habitat is called its niche. A niche is an organism's role in its ecosystem. It includes its habitat, its physical requirements. How much light does it need? Does it need water? Of course it does, but how much? What are its food sources? Is it an autotroph? A heterotroph? And we're also looking at the time of day it's active, its place on the food chain, and when and how it reproduces. So different species can easily occupy the same habitat as long as they have different niches or different roles. So a niche is an ecological area that involves both the place where an organism lives and the roles that an organism has in its habitat. For example, the ecological niche of a sunflower growing in the backyard includes absorbing light, water, nutrients, so it can do photosynthesis, providing shelter and food for other organisms like a bee, an ant, and giving off oxygen in the atmosphere. So the ecological niche of an organism depends not only on where it lives, but also on what it does. By analogy, it may be said that the habitat is the organism's address, and the niche is its profession, biologically speaking. So think of, again, habitat as the address, niche as the profession, because that's the role. For example, a worm, its address, or habitat, is the soil. It's in the ground. Its profession, or its niche, is specifically typed to mix up soil. It helps to make sure that soil is mixed up, including the organic and inorganic components. So there are factors that affect ecosystems. And again, within ecosystems, we have living organisms. And we're going to be looking at that type or biotic part, as well as the abiotic part, or non-biological or non-living physical factors. And any change in the biotic or abiotic factors of an ecosystem will affect the organisms living there. And this could include all living things that share the same habitat and the ways in which they affect one another. Things like all the producers, consumers, and decomposers. Within a particular ecosystem, they have relationships or interrelationships among organisms, and that is also considered a part of the biotic factors. So some relationships include predator-prey. Some organisms eat others. Some organisms are eaten by others. Symbiotic relationships, like the rhizobia bacteria in plants. Competition. Animals compete for similar food items. And overpopulation, which can dictate population density. The abiotic factors in an environment include things like the amount of sunlight or amount of rain, how oxygen is cycling through that environment, or how water is cycling. What are the soil conditions? Dry, moist, a mixture of organic, decaying, and living matter? What are the temperature ranges, pollution, or even are there frequent wildfires? So things that are biotic are living factors that influence an ecosystem. Things that are abiotic are non-living. So here are some biotic components. We're looking at different species that incorporate themselves into an environment. They inhabit different habitats, and they all have or play their own role or have a niche. Abiotic, again, is non-living, and these are factors that influence an ecosystem, like weather, things like amount of rain and amount of sunlight. We also have to consider community interactions, things like predation, which is a relationship between species in which one organism, the predator, eats another, which is the prey. Like lions and hyena, they tend to be predators of other organisms. We see this in food chains and webs that show the energy transfer as predators consume prey. And there's different types of predation. True predation is when a predator kills their prey in order to eat it, whereas a grazing type of predation is a type that can kill plants if overgrazing occurs, but usually doesn't. So that's actually a primary consumer that doesn't have the goal of killing a plant, but if it overdoes it, can result in a type of predation. So a cow could technically be considered a predator. So predation provides population control for prey species, so it is needed. So if you have over or under predation, that can throw off an ecosystem, put it out of balance. An example, in the early 1900s, wolves, which are a natural predator of deer, had pretty much completely been eradicated in the United States. So as a result, deer were not being predated as much, and the deer population exploded, and a food shortage for deer occurred. There were too many of them, and they were eating similar food items. So 41 wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in 1995 and through 1997, and that caused numerous changes in an ecosystem. So as a result, the deer and even the elk populations declined. They now had a predator. But previously, ravaged valleys and meadows that had been preyed upon by the deer using them as food items, they began to regenerate because prey was avoiding areas where they were more likely to be predated. And also some were being predated and there were just less deer and even elk present. We also saw that birds and beavers returned to areas they previously had abandoned. Beavers created dams that produced ponds that changed the environment, that changed habitats. So we created habitats that were ideal for new types of organisms like otters and ducks and fish. The wolves also killed coyotes, and coyotes generally went after rabbits. And when the rabbit population started to increase because the coyotes were being killed and weren't there to predate them, it actually brought foxes and hawks to the area in order to eat, or because of the high amount of rabbits that were spawning due to the killed coyotes. So notice that one type of organismal introduction can change an entire ecosystem because prey and predator species are very much interrelated. So predation is just one organism capturing and feeding on another. The predator is the one that does the killing, and the prey is the one that is the food. So these are just some examples. You can see we have a snake eating a frog. We have one bacterium eating another one. We also have lions attacking an ox. And we can study, for example, what happens when you introduce a certain prey item or another predator into an environment. And that's exactly what we did in 1995 through 1997, is we studied the result of the addition of wolves into Yellowstone National Park. And this is just one type of community interaction. Another type is symbiosis. And there's different types of symbiosis. There's mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Mutualism is a relationship between two or more organisms of different species where all benefit from the association. So in mutualism, both organisms in the relationship benefit, like rhizobia in plants, or nitrogen-fixing bacteria that aren't rhizobia on the roots of legumes. So the plant provides nutrients to the bacteria, and the bacteria fix nitrogen, so the plant can absorb it. A mutually beneficial relationship. There's also commensalism. This is a relationship between two organisms of different species, where one benefits and the other doesn't benefit, but it's also not harmed. Like barnacles on a whale. The barnacles are protected to an extent from predators because they're on a whale and they're moving more constantly than they would be if they were on a rock. And the whale's not harmed, it just has barnacles on it. It's not helped either. And then there's parasitism, a relationship between two organisms of different species where one benefits and the other not harmed. And then there's parasitism, a relationship between two organisms of different species where one benefits and the other is harmed, like fleas and ticks on dogs. So for example, fleas and ticks feed on blood of their host animal, and the dog loses blood. It also can have an allergic reaction, could get diseases from the fleas. You see the same thing with mosquitoes and other animals, including humans. So yes, the mosquito does feed on blood. It's getting something beneficial, but the human could lose blood. They could have an allergic reaction. You also can get diseases like West Nile from mosquitoes. So symbiosis has different types of relationships, but it's always a relationship between two different species that live relatively closely together. Mutualism, both species benefit. It's win-win, like insects and flowers, or a sea anemone and a clownfish. Commensalism, still two species, and it's kind of like a win or win zero. So one member of the association benefits, and the other is neither harmed or helped. Again, barnacles on a whale, great example. And then with commensalism, we have more examples. There's also the remora fish that attaches to the shark on its underside, sometimes on the top, and it gets a free ride. It also can eat kind of detritus or things like cyanobacteria and plankton, and it's able to move a lot more freely and quickly on a shark than it would be by itself. They actually have this sucker on their head that allows them to attach themselves to a shark. And then we also see that birds that build nests in trees have a commensalistic relationship with the tree. They're generally not hurting the tree, but they're also not helping the tree. But they're getting help, they're getting a home. And then there's parasitism. And that's when one organism lives on the inside, another organism, or partially harms it. And not all parasitism is when an organism lives inside the other organism, but it is a common type. Usually a parasite obtains all or part of its nutritional needs from the host. So there's definitely a winner and a loser in this type of symbiotic relationship, or in parasitism. So fleas on a dog was another example, and again, that's when we don't see necessarily the organism inside the other, but usually when you think of parasitism, you do think of things that embed themselves within the tissue of an organism, something like a tapeworm, for example. But fleas on dog, definitely an example of an ectoparasite, so not all parasites are endoparasites, which live inside their host. We are also going to look at some more examples of parasitism. There's a type of wasp that lays its eggs on the back of a caterpillar, and the caterpillar isn't immediately harmed, but when the wasp eggs hatch, they utilize the caterpillar for food. You can see sea lampreys feeding on the fluid of other fish. Now, sea lampreys don't generally hurt humans or like to use humans as food items, so we don't really have too much to fear from them, but they love aquatic organisms like fish. And if a sea lamprey feeds on a fish enough, it can cause its death. And then for humans, mosquito, again, a great example. Again, they're getting nutrients, they're getting blood, which they feed on. We're possibly getting diseases, and definitely something that is a reaction or allergic reaction. Most people form a bump that is itchy once they've been predated on by a mosquito. There are other community interactions that aren't predation, that aren't a type of symbiosis, and they are competition. So competition is a relationship between organisms for a limited supply of at least one resource. Usually it's food, can be water, even shelter or territory or mates. There are two types of competition, intraspecific and interspecific. Intraspecific happens between members of the same species when they compete for a resource. When members of different species compete for a resource, it is interspecific competition. And in some cases of interspecific competition, an invasive species can be introduced and cause competitive exclusion, when scarce resources and competition for that resource can lead to the extinction of one of the competing species. Invasive species are any non-native plant or animal brought into a habitat by accident, and that's usually to a detrimental effect, or again, the extinction of the other organism that is not the better at or the extinction of the other organism that is not better at competition. So one example of interspecific competition is European rabbits and the Australian herd animals that directly competed for grazing land. So there was an Australian sheep rancher named Thomas Austin who released 24 European rabbits into his property. And he had imported or brought over these rabbits from Europe to Australia for sport. So he just wanted to release them, and rabbits tend to produce or mate very quickly and produce a lot of offspring. And so he just wanted to kind of basically have target practice on his land. But the European rabbits' numbers grew exponentially, as rabbit populations generally do, and they also therefore needed more nutrients, they needed more land and habitat, and they grazed on that land that had previously been reserved for sheep and goats. And these European rabbits didn't stay on Thomas Austin's property. They spread out, they became a national pest, they became an invasive species, and they began competing with sheep and goats for grazing land and causing erosion of ranchers' lands. Because of the grazing, oftentimes there were less grass to hold on to the drier dirt that you see in Australia. So erosion occurred. And scientists actually then engineered a virus in the 1900s that only affected the European rabbits, and that has efficiently and effectively lowered the numbers of the rabbits in recent years, but they are definitely still a nuisance in Australia. So this is a good example of not only interspecific competition, but also competitive exclusion. Even though an animal didn't quite go extinct, it got close with the sheep and the goats because they had to compete with this new invasive organism. So ecological interactions between organisms can be competition, again, usually for food, water, or shelter. And sometimes this can be so severe that one of the organisms competing eventually goes extinct. Now, another example of competition is squirrels. So until Americans introduced the gray squirrel into parts of England in the early 20th century, red squirrels had been the primary type of squirrel you saw there or saw in England. And the gray squirrel were larger, they bred faster, and they also more successfully competed for resources. So within a couple of years of the introduction of the gray squirrel in England, the red squirrel disappeared. So we essentially saw competitive exclusion for real this time, not almost competitive exclusion, with the introduction of the gray squirrel in England. We also see that monkeys compete with each other and other animals for food. Rams compete with each other for mates. These are all just further examples of competition. Our next topic is factors that affect ecosystems. One factor is climate. And temperature ranges and the amount of rainfall are key factors defining the types of ecosystems. The different climates found on Earth largely result from the uneven heating patterns of the sun. Notice the sun's energy at the equator is the most focused, most concentrated, whereas at the periphery, or the areas further away from the equator, it's less concentrated, and it becomes more and more spread out over a larger area. These differences in temperature drive global air and water currents, and it's what gives us our weather. And it also produces major biomes because there are different climates in different parts of the world. So biomes are generally classified by their climate and the types of vegetation that grow in them. Biomes are divided into terrestrial or land biomes and aquatic or water biomes. The terrestrial biomes only cover about 30% of the Earth or less. Aquatic biomes account for most of the biomes, and they're the major component of the biosphere, but they have less total biomass than the terrestrial biomes. So most organisms, especially the ones that we're going to talk about, live in terrestrial biomes. But the largest aquatic biome is the marine biome, the oceans, coral reefs, and estuary ecosystems, where 98% of the Earth's water is salty. Sunlight availability also can affect the major biomes, and the amount of nutrients dissolved in water are two defining characteristics of aquatic biomes. So here you can see the different types of biomes and their location. There are tropical forests, savannas, deserts, and chaparral, temperate grasslands, temperate broadleaf forests, coniferous forests, and tundras. There's also areas with high mountains and polar ice. Not exactly types of biomes we're going to be looking at, but notice you start to see some themes. Around the equator is where we see most of the tropical forests. Tropical forests tend to give way to savannas and then deserts. We find most of the coniferous forests and tundras further up north. And then areas that have chaparral are going to be some of the most dry, but tend to be near a coast. So for biomes, we're looking at communities that exist within certain abiotic conditions. It's the abiotic conditions that determine the biome. We're looking at climate and vegetation. The major terrestrial biomes are what we'll look at first. They include tundras, taigas or a boreal forest, a temperate deciduous forest, savannas, also known as tropical grasslands, temperate grasslands, tropical rainforests, chaparrals, and desert. So first we'll look at the tundra. This is an area with permanently frozen soil, not a lot of growth or large plants. It's usually very Arctic, it's northern, we have long, cold winters, very little rain, very short growing season. There's already not a lot of plants. What plants we do have tend to be short. We don't see a lot of trees. We see mosses, lichens, shrubs. And again, that permanently frozen soil, that's called permafrost. Also, areas that do have water tend to form bogs in the summer. And then we see types of organisms like oxen, owls, Arctic foxes, caribou, and migratory birds and insects. Next, we have the taiga or boreal forest, and it's an area where you see a lot of conifer trees. It's areas of northern Europe, Asia, and North America where you might find a taiga or boreal forest. It's the largest biome. It is cold with long winters and high snowfall, but summers do exist, but they're short, and they have a lot of nearly constant daylight. So there's tons of coniferous forest in a taiga or boreal forest. This is the area where you find moose, bear, wolves, even the snowshoe hare. A temperate or deciduous forest has organisms like a deer, a fox, a coyote, chipmunks, and squirrels. And they have trees that lose their leaves, such as the beech, the maple, the oak. They tend to have extreme temperature differences between the winter and the summer, with 4 distinct seasons. Northeastern US, Western Europe, and Eastern Asia have areas that contain temperate or deciduous forests. Again, this area is usually dominated with 3 species that shed their leaves in winter months, and again, those are the beech, maple, and oak. Next, let's look at the savannas, which sometimes are known as grasslands. Central South America, Central Africa, North Australia, and India are areas where you might find such types of biomes. And a type of grassland biome that experiences rainy seasons and long periods of drought is a way that you could describe a tropical grassland like a savanna. This is where you would see something like a giraffe, a zebra, antelope, a lion, or hyena. Tons of plants with vertical leaves and large horizontal roots or thorns. We tend to see a lot of growth at only the top levels or branches of trees because of predation or the grazing from animals that eat the bottom parts. Something like the movie The Lion King occurred in a tropical grassland, a savanna. Next, we're going to look at temperate grasslands. These have really nutrient-rich, fertile soils, very hot summers, cold winters, and they have moderate rain, but not enough to support trees. So, unlike the tropical grasslands, we don't see trees really in temperate grasslands. You may have heard these called prairies. We see a lot more short grasses, some tall grasses, flowers, herbs with deep root systems, and these are often susceptible to drought and fire. Organisms like antelope, bison, owls, prairie dogs, and even prairie chickens can be found in these temperate grasslands that are in spaces like the interior of North America, South America, Asia, and Africa. Next, let's look at the tropical rainforest. And this is a biome that's located near the equator in Southeast Asia, Central and South America, Africa. It has a wet, hot, and humid environment and greater than 200 to 450 centimeters of rain per year. Even though it gets strong sunlight all year, it has poor nutrient soils, and debris that hits the ground floor very quickly decays. Greater than half of the world's plant and animal species exist in this type of environment, and we see a production of 40% of the Earth's oxygen and about a fourth of all medicines from plants, animals that live in this region. It covers 7% of the Earth's surface, but it used to be 20%. So tropical rainforests are on the decline because of things like deforestation and also hunting and trapping and even killing of certain organisms that make up this environment, this biome. The next biome we're going to look at is the chaparral. So we might find this in west coastal regions of the Mediterranean, US, Chile, Africa, and Australia. It's a temperate shrubland with moisture and temperatures between grasslands and deserts, so it's dry, but it has a coastal climate with little to no rain in the summer. Small shrubs with leathery leaves would be found here, herbs like sage and bay, and animals adapted to both areas or both kind of temperate amounts, like quail, lizards, and snakes, could be common or can be found in this area. Next, we're going to look at the temperate rainforest. We see it in the Pacific Northwest for US, like Washington State. It's also found in Central Europe, parts of Australia, and New Zealand. This area would have high precipitation and humidity, moderate temperatures, cool and moist, evergreen trees draped in lichens and mosses, ferns, frogs, bears, wolves, red pandas, and wombats all would be common to this area. Next is deserts, and this is an area that receives very little rainfall. Usually it experiences very hot days, but cold nights. The precipitation or rain is less than 25 centimeters per year. Areas of the Americas, Asia, Australia, and Africa have deserts. Very scattered vegetation, very sparse and few and far between, a dry environment, and plants and animals would have to be adapted for little moisture, something like a succulent or a cactus, and animals like a thorny devil, a hawk, a tortoise, or a camel would be found in this area. Next, we're going to look at the aquatic biomes. And the aquatic biomes are listed below. We got the marine biomes, which have salty water, like coral reefs, estuaries, and the ocean biomes. There's also standing freshwater biomes, like lakes and ponds, running freshwater biomes, like rivers and streams, and other freshwater biomes, like a wetland. So keep in mind that there are some limiting factors in water biomes. We're going to be looking at the amount of salt or salinity in the water, also the amount of dissolved oxygen, and how much sunlight. So in a marine biome, like oceans, there are areas that are defined by how much sunlight they get, photic and aphotic. The photic zone is above 200 meters, and this is the area where sunlight penetrates the water, and plant and animal life is very abundant. The aphotic zone is below 200 meters, so sunlight does not penetrate, so there's no plants, and animal life is highly specialized. We can look at some of the weird creatures you might find in the aphotic zone, like the anglerfish up top. Again, the aphotic zone is below 200 meters, and many of the organisms that exist here have adaptations like bioluminescence, where they glow in this dark environment. So looking at oceans, we can further define them by the amount of nutrients available to producers. The benthic zone runs along the ocean floor, and any benthic organism called a benthos lives on the ocean floor as well. This includes the intertidal zones. It extends from high to low tide, so it includes the shoreline along the continental shelf. Types of organisms you might find are worms, clams, crabs, sponges, but there's also the pelagic zone, which describes the open water column above the ocean floor, an area that is divided horizontally into the neritic and oceanic zone. The neritic zone is the water column above the continental shelf, whereas the oceanic zone is subdivided into vertical zones based on depth, like the epipelagic, with the photic zone. Or below the epipelagic zone, from highest to lowest, is mesopelagic, bathopelagic, abyssal pelagic, and hadal pelagic. So here's a diagram so we can look at these different areas. Again, the photic zone is the area that light could penetrate, and the rest light could not penetrate. So really only light penetrates in the epipelagic zone, which is considered photic. The oceanic column is after we get off the continental shelf, where we start to see very big increases in depth. Along the continental shelf or near the shoreline, not only are we mainly in the photic zone, we're on the shoreline, so this is also neritic. So looking at marine biomes, we can't leave out the coral reefs. And coral reefs are found in shallow tropical ocean waters where temperatures range from 68 to 88 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're underwater and they're mainly limestone structures. And they're generally formed or left over from colonies of living stony coral creatures. And they secrete calcium carbonate as their exoskeleton. But when those creatures die, they leave their exoskeleton behind. And aquatic plants and animals can also inhabit coral reef systems, and a lot of the coral is still living. And there's also many tropical fish that live in coral reef systems. Another marine biome is an estuary, and they're found anywhere the ocean meets a freshwater river or stream. And estuaries are shallow enough to allow ample sunlight and penetration for photosynthesis. So they tend to have a much broader or very well-working photic zone. Plants found in estuaries are adapted to life in these environments, meaning plants that live in estuaries have to be able to withstand the salinity or salt in the water. Mangrove trees, for example, push salt crystals out of their leaves and use their roots, which grow above the waterline, for gas exchange. So if you're looking at a freshwater biome, we're going to see that we have much lower salinity or almost no salinity when it comes to freshwater biomes. So flowing freshwater, it would be a river and a stream, whereas still freshwater would be a lake and a pond. So compared to the standing water biome, running water has more dissolved oxygen and nutrients in it, and that benefits aquatic organisms. So we'll look at running freshwater first. Streams are faster, and they tend to have greater force in their flow. And not only do they have more force, they tend to have more dissolved oxygen. So faster water means more oxygen dissolved. Whereas rivers, they move a little bit slower, a lot slower than a stream, and debris tends to settle at the bottom. And because of this, rivers tend to have more nutrients and less dissolved oxygen. Streams have water that travels too fast, and it tends to disrupt a lot of nutrients and organisms trying to grow at the bottom, but they do have more oxygen, so it's a trade-off. And fish that live in streams are adapted to fast-moving water. Something like a salmon actually tries to travel back upstream at a certain part of its life in order to spawn or produce new offspring. And so fish that live in streams have to be able to process food and nutrients quickly to create enough energy to travel in the fast-moving water. So here is an example of a river. Notice it's a little bit slower moving, and so you'd have a lot more vegetation in the bottom of this type of body of water. In aquatic biomes, you can find algae or cyanobacteria, and they're the main producers in streams and rivers. Something like plankton would be microscopic algae, and they float on the surface of aquatic biomes. They also can perform photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and for them, photosynthesis produces oxygen, while respiration produces glucose for fuel and carbon dioxide as a waste. And so we see photosynthesis and cellular respiration occur even in organisms found in aquatic biomes. But they need sunlight to survive because since they can perform photosynthesis, they are considered producers. So phytoplankton are very important producers in water biomes, and generally they're the first step. Again, they're the autotrophs in a lot of aquatic food chains. Standing freshwater biomes include ponds, which are small, shallow bodies of water, whereas lakes are larger and deeper than ponds. Ponds have sunlight that penetrates all the way to the bottom because they're smaller, and they usually are completely filled with plant material or detritus. They have a very high amount of nutrients. Whereas plant growth in a lake is limited generally just to the shoreline because sunlight doesn't penetrate all the way to the bottom. So there's no plants after a certain depth in a lake. So ponds are shallower than lakes, and sunlight goes all the way to the bottom of a pond. Lakes actually have an aphotic zone and a photic zone because they're much deeper than ponds. And then we have wetlands. Wetlands are terrestrial areas that are covered by fresh water for part of the year. Also called swamps, marshes, or bogs, vegetation is designed to withstand waterlogged soil with little oxygen in it. Wetlands contain the nutrient-rich water from floods and runoff, and because of the deeply rooted plant life, it helps prevent terrestrial erosion. And that brings us to our last topic, populations and communities. So populations and communities. What is a community disturbance? Once a community has been affected, sometimes drastically by a natural disturbance or disaster, a series of changes occurs. And that's a series of changes called an ecological succession. And there's a primary and secondary succession. Primary succession is any time a community arises in an area with no soil, such as after a lava flow or a glacial retreat. The first organisms to appear are called pioneer species, and usually that's an autotrophic type of microorganism. Moss, lichen, all of those would be common in a primary succession. A secondary succession generally follows a forest fire or some other disturbance that does damage an existing community, but it does leave the soil intact, such as a grass and a shrub. Those would be organisms that would be the first kind of vegetation to return. And generally, we have climax communities, or those that are thrive in the climate and soil conditions of the environment and generally remain stable until another disturbance changes them. Next, let's talk about characteristics of populations. Ecologists study populations using 3 characteristics: geographic distribution, population density, and growth rate. Geographic distribution is defining the boundaries of the area in which a population lives. A fish lives in a lake. A white-tailed deer population that extends throughout an entire state might be another descriptor for geographic distribution. Or we could look at population density, the number of individuals of a particular species in a given area, or a volume if studying water ecosystems. The number of wild rabbits per square kilometer in Australia is an example. Growth rate is the number of new individuals in a population at a particular time compared to a prior time period. And that depends on the number of births in a population, the number of deaths in a population, and the number of individuals that leave or enter a population. So looking at population growth, populations may become stable over time, neither increasing or decreasing. And that's generally going to happen if the birth rate and the death rate are equal. But if the birth rate is higher than the death rate, a population will increase. And if the death rate exceeds the birth rate, the population will decrease. However, animals may immigrate or move to an area when looking for a specific biotic or abiotic resource. This would mean they move into a different geographic area. And immigration is when organisms move out of an area. So the area they move into may gain more in population. The area they leave may see that population decrease. And the area that gains new animals may see then an increase in population density. And the area that loses animals to another geographical area may see the population density decrease. We can also look at a type of exponential growth wherein a population grows very rapidly. This is a type of population growth that is usually unhindered because of the abundance of resources for an ever-increasing population. The amount of food resources can slow population growth. This type of exponential growth is a population growth common if there are very few predators and little disease for a type of organism. Whereas logistical growth is population growth that is controlled by some type of limiting resource or the presence of predators or both. For example, when the birth rate and the death rate are about the same and the population stays steady, it is assumed that the population has reached carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the largest number of individuals of a species that an ecosystem can support. Because, for example, more of that particular type of individual in that species might start to put a strain on the amount of resources available for that particular organism. So there are limiting factors to growth, and they fall into one of 2 categories: density independent and density dependent. Density independent factors are abiotic. They're abiotic factors that are independent of the population density. Examples: pollution, use of pesticides or herbicides, or even a natural disturbance such as a volcano eruption. Density dependent are biotic factors that limit population growth. Examples include predation, competition, parasitism, and disease.